Margaret Sullivan, a 67-year-old widow, stood at the threshold of the home she had shared with her late husband, Robert, for more than 4 decades. The walls, once filled with laughter and memories of a steady marriage, now felt cold and foreign. Robert had passed away only weeks earlier, leaving Margaret fragile with grief and still trying to comprehend the emptiness in her life. Her only daughter, Victoria, and son-in-law, Kevin, seemed, at first, to step in with comforting words and gestures. They visited often, cooked her meals, and promised to take care of her during this difficult time. Margaret, in her vulnerable state, clung to their presence, believing her family bond would be her anchor through the storm of widowhood. But beneath their sympathetic smiles lay a scheme. Victoria had always resented her mother's quiet strength and the attention Robert gave her. Now, with Robert gone, she saw her chance to gain everything she believed she deserved. One morning, Victoria arrived with Kevin and a stack of papers. With a practiced air of authority, she declared that Robert's will had left the entire estate in her name. She claimed the house, the accounts, and all assets now legally belonged to her alone. Margaret was stunned. The announcement felt like a blow to the chest. Before she could fully protest, Victoria pressed her further, telling her mother it was best for everyone if she moved out quickly. To help her start anew, Victoria handed Margaret $200 in cash, as if years of love and sacrifice could be reduced to a handful of bills. Kevin stood by, arms crossed, his silence reinforcing Victoria's cruelty. Shaking and humiliated, Margaret gathered a few suitcases with only essentials clothes, a photo of Robert, and a few keepsakes. As she walked out the door, every step felt like betrayal, not just from her daughter, but from the family she thought she had. Yet, in the back of her mind, a spark of doubt remained. Robert had once shown her another will, one in which her security had been assured. Margaret left broken-hearted, yet suspicion began to stir beneath her grief. Something about Victoria's story didn't fit, and though she was alone and seemingly powerless, a quiet determination began to take root. This was not the end of her story, it was only the beginning. After days of restless nights in a small rented room, Margaret finally gathered the courage to seek answers. Her instincts told her something was wrong. Robert had always been deliberate, cautious, and protective of her. It was impossible to believe he would leave her with nothing after 43 years of shared life. With trembling hands, she dialed the number of Harrison Fitzgerald, Robert's longtime friend and trusted family lawyer. Harrison welcomed her into his office with a mix of sympathy and professionalism. His walls were lined with shelves of leather-bound legal volumes, and framed photographs of him with Robert over the years confirmed Margaret's trust in him. As she explained what Victoria had told her, Harrison's brow furrowed. He retrieved a thick file from his cabinet and laid it on the desk between them. "Margaret," he said firmly, "you need to know the truth. Robert did not abandon you. In fact, he went to great lengths to make sure you would always be taken care of." With deliberate care, Harrison read aloud the provisions of the real will. Robert had left Margaret 70% of his estate, the family home, and more than $23 million in liquid and investment assets. Victoria was to receive $10 million, but with a clear condition: her share would only be secured if she treated her mother with dignity and kindness. Margaret's heart pounded as she listened. Relief flooded her chest, followed by a deep ache of betrayal. Everything Victoria had said was a lie, Harrison continued, his voice steady but edged with anger. "Your daughter forged documents, Margaret. She altered Robert's will, presented a false version, and forced you out of your home. That is not only immoral, it's a crime. It's fraud, inheritance theft, and elder abuse." The words sank in like stones. Margaret felt dizzy, but at the same time, a flicker of strength returned to her. Victoria hadn't just betrayed her as a daughter, she had broken the law by forging those papers and by treating you so cruelly. Harrison explained, "Victoria has effectively disqualified herself. Legally, her actions nullify her right to the inheritance. She has destroyed her own future." Margaret sat back in her chair, torn between grief and resolve. She had been cast out like a beggar, but the truth was on her side. Robert had foreseen the danger their daughter posed and had left behind protections to shield her. For the first time since Robert's death, Margaret felt a sense of power stirring within her. Her daughter's lies had set this chain of events in motion, but the fight for justice had only just begun. Armed with the truth and Harrison Fitzgerald's unwavering support, Margaret refused to remain a victim any longer. Together, they met with detectives from the local police department and presented the evidence of Victoria's fraud: the forged documents, the false will, and Margaret's forced eviction. The officers listened carefully, their expressions darkening with each revelation. Elder abuse and inheritance fraud were serious crimes, and Victoria's scheme had crossed every legal boundary. Thus began Operation Justice. With court orders secured, Harrison and the authorities moved swiftly. Bank accounts under Victoria's name were frozen, credit cards disabled, and utilities tied to the family estate redirected under Margaret's rightful ownership. It was a precise and deliberate reversal of power. Every thread Victoria had tried to pull was now cut loose. Victoria and Kevin were blindsided. At first, they thought the bank declines were a glitch, but when Victoria's platinum card was declined in front of friends at a boutique, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. Days later, when the electricity went out at their apartment and the internet was cut off, panic set in. Kevin shouted, slamming his fists on the table, while Victoria dialed number after number, demanding answers. Each time, she was told the same thing: her access was revoked. The final blow came at a high-end restaurant. Victoria, desperate to cling to the illusion of control, had invited friends for a celebratory dinner, bragging about her inheritance. But just as the dessert arrived, police officers entered. The room fell silent as they approached her table. In front of stunned onlookers, Victoria was handcuffed and arrested for fraud, elder abuse, and document forgery. Her protests and shrieks of disbelief echoed through the restaurant. But no one came to her defense. Kevin, thinking he might escape scrutiny, kept a low profile, but investigators had already uncovered his involvement in falsifying signatures and coaching Victoria on how to pressure her mother. Within 24 hours, he too was arrested, pulled from their apartment in the early morning, still in his robe, as neighbors peeked through their doors. For Margaret, the moment she set foot back in her home was bittersweet. She walked slowly through the familiar halls, touching the walls, as though reacquainting herself with an old friend. The house no longer felt like a prison of grief but a fortress reclaimed. She opened windows to let in fresh air, replacing the stale silence with a sense of renewal. Though betrayal still weighed heavily on her heart, Margaret now held the reins of her own life. She had taken the first true step toward independence, not as Robert's wife, not as Victoria's mother, but as a woman standing on her own terms. The war was far from over, but for the first time, she no longer felt powerless. The first meeting between Margaret and her daughter, after the arrest, was arranged in a sterile interrogation room. Victoria, stripped of her designer clothes and seated in a plain jumpsuit, looked smaller than Margaret had ever seen her, yet her eyes still carried the same defiance. When the guards stepped out, Victoria leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Mom, please, forgive me. I was angry, confused. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Her words dripped with desperation. But Margaret had learned too much to be swayed by false sentiment. She studied her daughter carefully, trying to reconcile the pleading woman before her with the child she had once held in her arms. "You didn't just get confused, Victoria," Margaret said evenly. "You planned every step. You forged documents. You threw me out of my own home. And you would have taken everything if the truth hadn't come out." Victoria broke into sobs, insisting that she had only wanted what she felt was rightfully hers. But Margaret had one more truth to reveal, a truth that cut deeper than any accusation. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small flash drive Harrison had given her. With the help of the officer in the room, they played the video on a laptop. Robert's face appeared on the screen, aged but determined. His voice was calm, but tinged with sorrow. "If you're watching this, Margaret, then my fears have come true. I love Victoria, but I know her nature. Her ambition has always walked a dangerous line, and I worried she might one day turn that ambition against you. That is why I placed conditions on her inheritance, not to punish her, but to protect you. If she cannot honor you as her mother, then she deserves nothing from me." The video ended, leaving silence to fill the room. Victoria covered her face with her hands, her sobs turning raw and unrestrained. The words of her father, words she could not argue with, had shattered the last of her defenses. "I just wanted the money. I thought it would make me powerful," she confessed, her voice muffled between tears. "I thought Dad always loved you more, and I wanted to prove myself. But I was wrong. I see it now." Margaret felt no triumph in hearing the admission, only sorrow that her daughter's heart had been consumed by greed. She leaned back, her eyes cold, her voice steady. "Your father gave you a choice, Victoria, and you chose betrayal. Now you must live with the consequences of that choice. Neither I nor the law can save you from yourself." Victoria wept, begging for another chance, But Margaret remained unmoved. For the first time in her life, she refused to protect her daughter from accountability. Robert had trusted her to stand strong, and she would not fail him now. The confrontation ended, not with reconciliation, but with a painful clarity. Margaret had lost her daughter long before the arrests, and there was no going back. Just as Margaret began to settle back into her home, believing the storm had finally passed, another shadow loomed over her life. One afternoon, she received an unexpected visit from Eleanor Hayes, Kevin's mother. Eleanor was a woman of imposing presence, her sharp eyes scanning Margaret's living room, as though assessing the value of every item within it. She wasted no time with pleasantries. "My son doesn't deserve prison," Eleanor began coldly, sliding an envelope across the table. Inside were bank slips and a handwritten promise, $2 million in exchange for Margaret dropping the charges against Kevin. "If 2 isn't enough, I can make it 5. Think of it as a way to close this painful chapter quickly for everyone." Margaret pushed the envelope back without opening it. "Your son made his choices. He stood by Victoria while she destroyed me. Money won't erase that." Eleanor's expression hardened. She leaned in, her voice lowering to a venomous whisper. "Then you should know the truth about your perfect husband. Robert was not the man you thought he was. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a criminal. He laundered millions over the years, and if the authorities dig deep enough, you'll lose everything. The FBI won't care that you were his wife. They'll seize the house, the accounts, all of it. You'll be left with nothing." The words struck Margaret like ice water. She wanted to dismiss them as another cruel tactic, but doubt gnawed at her heart. Eleanor seemed too confident, too certain, desperate for clarity. Margaret hired Carol Chen, a respected financial investigator with a reputation for uncovering even the most carefully hidden crimes. For weeks, Carol combed through Robert's business records, offshore accounts, and old transactions. The findings were devastating. Robert, the man Margaret had trusted and loved for over 4 decades, had been laundering money through shell companies and consulting fees for more than 12 years. Millions had flowed through accounts disguised as legitimate income, but the trail was clear. The fortune Margaret thought was her security was now tainted with criminal origins. Carol delivered the news gently, but there was no way to soften the blow. "If the FBI takes this up, Mrs. Sullivan, they can and will seize everything. To them, it won't matter that you were unaware. The assets are compromised." Margaret sat in silence, her hands trembling on the armrest of her chair. First her daughter's betrayal, and now her husband's secret life. The foundations of her world had crumbled once again. The estate that had once symbolized love, family, and security now felt like a ticking time bomb. The fight was no longer just about reclaiming what was hers. It was about survival. And as Margaret stared into the dark truth of Robert's past, she realized the next battle would be even more dangerous than the last. Word of Robert's tainted fortune spread quickly once investigators began piecing together his financial records. From her holding cell, Victoria learned of the danger her inheritance faced. She and Kevin hatched a desperate plan. If they could provide the FBI with documents and insider details about Robert's laundering schemes, they might negotiate immunity or at least lighter sentences. The idea of betraying Robert's memory didn't trouble them. To Victoria, her father was nothing more than a failed gatekeeper who had denied her what she believed she deserved. Kevin, ever the opportunist, saw a chance to save himself and perhaps walk away wealthier than before. Together, they arranged for a lawyer to reach out to federal agents, dangling the promise of exclusive evidence in exchange for their freedom. But Margaret, guided by Harrison Fitzgerald and investigator Carol Chen, had already made her choice. Instead of waiting to be crushed under the weight of Robert's sins, she walked into the FBI office herself. Sitting across from seasoned agents, she laid everything bare: the forged will, Victoria's fraud, Kevin's collusion, and even Robert's long-hidden crimes. "I will not lie for him," she declared, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "And I will not allow my daughter and son-in-law to use his sins as a shield. If that means losing everything, then so be it. But I will face the truth head-on." The agents, impressed by her candor, offered her a role as a cooperating witness. If she was willing to help them build a solid case against Victoria and Kevin, they would protect her and consider leniency regarding the estate. Margaret agreed without hesitation. For the first time in months, she felt not like a pawn but a player in control of the board. When the FBI asked if she would wear a wire to capture Victoria and Kevin's scheme in real time, Margaret's hands trembled, but she said yes. The thought of confronting her own daughter in such a way pierced her heart, but she knew it was the only way to bring the nightmare to an end. The meeting was staged in Margaret's home, the very place where her betrayal had begun. Victoria and Kevin arrived, their expressions slick with false confidence. They believed Margaret was desperate to cut a deal and reclaim some of her wealth. Sitting across from her mother, Victoria whispered with an edge of triumph, "All we need to do is hand the FBI Dad's secrets, and we walk away clean. You'll thank us later when you still have the house." Margaret listened silently, every word captured by the hidden microphone beneath her blouse. Kevin chimed in, detailing which accounts and shell companies could be sacrificed to appease the authorities. They thought they were masterminds. In truth, they were digging their own graves. Within moments of Victoria's final admission that she cared nothing for her father's memory, only for the money, agents stormed the room. Victoria and Kevin were arrested on the spot, their immunity gambit shattered by their own recorded words. That as the chaos unfolded, Margaret remained seated, calm and composed. She had walked into the storm willingly, and she had walked out unbroken. No longer the grieving widow, cast out with $200. She was now the woman who had faced her husband's darkest secrets and her daughter's betrayal and prevailed. Margaret Sullivan, once a victim, had become the author of her own survival. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one truth was clear: she would never again be powerless.